Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to look at the changes to the 2019 edition of NFPA 13. I apologize up front, I won't be able to stay for questions for after the panel, but if you do have any questions, you can give me a call at Viking anytime and I'll be happy to help you out. When we look at the changes, there's a lot of changes going on, but it's mostly due to the reformatting of NFPA 13. So those of us familiar with the standard that have worked with it for quite some time, we know that there's a lot of different information scattered throughout all the different chapters in NFPA 13. Well, with this reformatting, it's breaking it down, and it's going to make it a lot easier for those that are newer to the standard to read it, to learn it, as well as those of us familiar with it right now. In the near future, we'll get used to it as well, and it'll be much easier to find the information that we're looking for. So a little historical perspective here on NFPA 13. In 1991, the standard was completely rewritten. Come 99, that's when all the storage got added into NFPA 13. So we went away from the 230s. So NFPA 230 used to be your storage with different storage classifications for commodities through different sets of NFPA 230. But then it was added into NFPA 13 in 1999. In 2002, a manual of style changes and reorganization of the storage chapters that were brought in back in 99 was done. And now coming to 2019, we're going to completely have a revision of NFPA 13 that we're going to be looking at. So some of the problems that existed in the way that it was formatted before were redundancies of storage as well as some gaps. It was very difficult to find information at times. Chapter 8 was where everything was thrown. It was your catch-all bucket for different obstructions, sprinklers. You had pilot line detection in there. You had concealed spaces. So there was a lot of information in Chapter 8. So Chapter 8 has been completely broke down, and all that information can be found in different chapters now. And then there was lack of sequential logic to using the standard. So now it's going to be set up. If you have a certain type of sprinkler, you go to this chapter to find the information on that sprinkler. So with the new arrangement, we're going to have two general requirement chapters. Chapter 8 is split into multiple chapters, as I just stated earlier. Storage chapters are reorganized around the type of sprinkler, so whether it's a control mode density area, control mode specific application, or an ESFR sprinkler, they're all going to have their own individual chapters for storage. In-rack sprinkler requirements are all going to be located in one chapter. So Steve was talking about that yesterday with the ESFR being used for in-racks. That's going to be in that chapter as well. So the new layout is going to look like this. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, which Chapter 1 is just basically your administration and your introduction to the standard. Chapter 2 is references to other publications that are used throughout the standard. They are going to remain the same. Chapter 3, where you find your definitions, now it's all going to be alphabetical. So in the past, you'd have to look around and find the classification because they were kind of grouped together with what they applied to, but now you'll know you're just going alphabetically through the standard to find that information. Chapter 4, that's going to be your general requirements, and it's actually going to be true general requirements now for your system. So just an overall basic look at the requirements of the standard. Chapter 5, we get into water supplies, where that used to be in one of the later chapters. Now it's going to be right up front, because that's where the sprinkler system starts at, with your water supply. 6 is going to be the installation of underground piping. So you can see how this is kind of coming through. We're starting with the water supply. Now we got the underground piping that's coming through. So you're getting that logic to how it's going to be formatted moving forward 2019 and beyond. Chapter 7 is going to be system components and hardware. Chapter 8 is going to be your overall system requirements. Chapter 9 is going to be sprinkler location requirements. In 10, we're going to have installation requirements for standard spray sprinklers, Chapter 11 is going to cover extended coverage sprinklers. So those of you that were here yesterday when I presented on extended coverage sprinklers, you would go to Chapter 11 to find all that information that I was referring to, instead of having to go throughout the standard and try to find it where it might be at in different chapters. 12, which used to be your general storage chapter, is now going to be for residential sprinklers. One of the nice things about Chapter 12 with residential sprinklers, those of you that are familiar with 13R and 13D, they added information about residential sprinklers for beams and slope ceilings, but they didn't add it to NFPA 13, but now it's added in the new 2019 edition. So it'll take some of that, those questions, well, if I have 13R or 13D, what do I do in 13 with residential sprinklers? Now all that information is located in NFPA 13 as well. Chapter 13 is for CMSA sprinklers, control mode specific application. Into 14, that's where we have our ESFR sprinklers located. Chapter 15 is going to be requirements for special sprinklers. By special sprinklers, it's going to be ones that don't fall into a specific category like an ESFR or CMDA for specific types of areas. 16, we're going to have the installation of piping, valves, and appurtenances. So that's going to be for sprinklers as well as your different pipes that are being used, whether it's steel piping or CPVC piping that's being used. 17 is going to be for hanging and support of the systems, where 18 is now going to be for seismic protection. Once we get into Chapter 19, now we're looking at design approaches and calculations. That was basically all in Chapter 11 before, but now it's condensed all into Chapter 19, so you won't have to go through and find certain different requirements, such as velocities. Velocities were in a later chapter, and now they're all going to be in the same chapter with all that information. Chapter 20 are general requirements for storage, so that's basically been moved from Chapter 12-20 now with some additional changes as well. Chapter 22, we have our control mode specific application requirements for storage. So now we're getting into the specific sprinklers for storage. So you saw before that we had a CMSA chapter, but that was just for the requirements of obstructions and certain other requirements. Now we're getting into the requirements once you have a high-piled storage application for CMSA sprinklers. When we get to Chapter 23, we're looking at ESFR requirements for storage applications. Chapter 24 is going to be alternative sprinkler system designs. 25, that's where everything's going to be for your in-racks, whether it's the ESFR sprinklers being used in the in-racks or whether it's just your standard smaller K-factors that we've been used to for years. All that information will now be found in Chapter 25. Chapter 26, special occupancy requirements. Piers and wharves, that's a good example of a design approach that you might find in Chapter 26 now. Chapter 27, your system acceptance, so placing your system into service. So you can see how it's sequential logic that's being used here as we're going through. We started with water supplies. Now in Chapter 27, we've worked all our way up to the acceptance of the system once it's already installed. So that's going to cover your hydrostatic test, where you pressurize it for 2 hours to make sure that you don't have any leaks in the system before placing it in service. Chapter 28, existing system modifications. A good example of something you might find in there would be how you cannot remove a sprinkler and then reinstall it. So once a sprinkler has been removed, it cannot be reinstalled. That would be something that's located in Chapter 28 now. Chapter 29 is going to be our marine systems. And then we finish Chapter 30 with system inspection, testing, and maintenance. So once the system's already been installed, it's been accepted, now we're going back to inspect it and maintain it. In Chapter 8, 8.1 now moves to 9.1. 8.2 for system protection area limitations moves to 4.5. The use of sprinklers themselves is going to be moved to Section 9.4. Application of sprinkler types is going to move between Chapter 10, 11, and 14 because now we're breaking all our sprinklers down to the specific chapter in which you're going to find all that information. Position, location, and spacing and use of sprinklers is now going to move to 9.5. And in Chapter 10, we're going to have both standard pendant and upright spray sprinklers, as well as sidewall standard coverage sprinklers. So in that chapter, that's where you're going to find the spacing limitations that I was talking about for standard coverage sprinklers, where you find that information right in NFPA 13, but with extended coverage sprinklers, you'll find it on the manufacturer's data sheet. So extended coverage sprinklers now are going to be into Chapter 11, as well as sidewall. So both the uprights, the pendants, and the sidewalls are all going to be grouped into the same chapter. 8.10, we moved residential sprinklers to Chapter 12, CMSA sprinklers to 13. So we're getting a lot of changes. We're breaking up all of Chapter 8 in this new format of the 2019 edition. NRACs now have their own chapter in Chapter 25. The pilot line detectors that I was talking about that's going to remain in Chapter 8, but now it's going to be Section 8.10. We have our special situations, which moves to 9.2. Piping installation has its own chapter now in Chapter 16. System attachments, same thing, Chapter 16. And then we have electrical bonding and grounding, which is going to be in Chapter 16 as well. So as you can see, like I stated at the start of the presentation, Chapter 8 was a catch-all for everything. Everything just seemed to get dumped into Chapter 8. So that whole chapter is being broken up now, and it's going to make more logical reasoning as to why where those sections are at. So with Chapter 8, now we're looking at system types and requirements. Where an air compressor is dedicated air supply, it shall be installed in accordance with NFPA 70, Article 430. So this means you can't use a light switch anymore for air compressor. The disconnecting means for an automatic air compressor shall not be a general use light switch or a cord and plug connected to a motor. So now it's going to have to be hardwired. So that's not going to be an option in NFPA 13 anymore. Another big one here, effective January of 2021, anytime you remove the coil from a solenoid, because we see that all the time. We see the coils getting removed and then the system's not going to operate. So come 2021, all manufacturers have to have it so that if that coil gets removed, it's going to give you a supervisory alarm. So no one will be able to just leave that coil off of the solenoids and not have a functioning system anymore. Chapter 9, sprinkler location requirements, sidewall sprinklers. This was removed for a notice of intent to make a motion. What that is it's brought up at the NFPA technical meeting, and then it's debated back and forth. There'll be somebody that submits it, and there'll be people that oppose it most of the time, and they'll kind of debate it out. And then at the end, after the debate closes, what will happen is everybody at the meeting will vote on it. If it gets voted down, then it won't be put into the standard. But if it gets voted yes, then it's going to be added to the standard. And these are two examples of the NIPMAMs, the notice of intent to make motion, that were accepted and are going to be changes to the standard. So one is no more sidewall sprinklers at the bottom of the elevator pits. So that's not going to be required anymore as it used to be in the past. And also smaller vestibule areas are not going to require protection as well. Another change that we have is insulation used to measure the sprinkler deflector distance shall be bat insulation or insulation that will withstand 0.3 kilograms per square meter. So it's got to be a heavier duty insulation now. That was never called out before in the past, and it left it open to interpretation. When you're locating a sprinkler below an obstruction, there's more clear criteria as to where you can place the sprinkler now. So instead of just saying put the sprinkler below the obstruction, now there's a detail that's going to show you exactly where you can put the sprinkler at. Chapter 12, this is for residential sprinklers. That's what I was talking about earlier. So all this information that you're seeing there is added from 13D and 13R, but now it's added into NFPA 13 for the residential applications. Also, when you have a sprinkler placed in a beam, that's also being added to NFPA 13 with figures showing you exactly how to do it. In this case, we're looking at a recess pendant. If you're not placing it in the beam, there's position information as to where you can place it alongside the beam. Say you can't drill through the beam because the structural requirements of the beam won't allow it, and you just place the sprinkler beside it, there's information as to how to space that. Another big one here is for concealed sprinklers. So there is information now showing that concealed sprinklers can be installed in beams. That was left up to interpretation before in the past, but now it's in the standard, and it gives you the figure as to how you would go about doing that. Chapter 16, installation of piping and valves, it talks about CPVC in this area for private garages within a dwelling unit not exceeding 1,000 square feet. So smaller garages, you can extend the CPVC piping now out into those areas. Whereas in the past, once again, that was kind of left up to interpretation, usually to the authority having jurisdiction, whether they would allow that or not. Our general requirements for storage, this is where you're going to find the information that you would typically find in Chapter 12 and the older editions, which will now be located in Chapter 20. 22, for our control mode specific application, it's going to have all your tables telling you exactly what design pressure and how many sprinklers to calculate when you do a control mode specific application design. And then Chapter 25 with our in-rack sprinklers. For example, the ESFR in-racks with where you don't balance the ceiling as well as the in-racks when you're using the ESFRs for the in-racks anymore is now in NFPA 13. Chapter 27 for our plans and calculations, it clarifies that there is no limitation on velocity. So that was also something that would come up. A lot of people limited the velocity that the water could travel through the pipe at, and now that's going away. So as long as the system calculates out, you can have a higher velocity with smaller piping. Thank you for your time.